Hey everyone, I'm Will, and in today's video we're going to be looking at seascape photography, and I want to share with you 5 tips which I think will help you in your creative process next time you head out on the coast with your camera. As always, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you, and also check out the link in the description for a massive seascape photography masterclass which I recently put together. Alright, let's get into it. Seascapes have been at the core of my photography since I first picked up a camera. I used to live on the coast in Australia, and I'd say the first 2 years of my photography, at least 90% was coastal scenes. Now that I live in New Zealand, obviously the environment is much different. However, I did recently dedicate 5 months or so of just capturing coastal scenes again. And when I released this new body of work, it was interesting to observe how different my approach is these days compared to how it was when I first started out, even up until a few years ago. So these are some of the things that I'm going to share with you now. So let's get into it. Tip number 1, speed up the shutter. Now, I dare say if you search in Google seascape photography, the overwhelming majority of images are probably shot with a slow shutter. Now, there's probably 2 reasons for that. Firstly, it was probably captured in low light. Let's face it, we love our sunrises and sunsets. So in that low light, you typically need a slower shutter to get the exposure bright enough. But also, the second thing is that, let's face it, it does look nice to use a slow shutter on the water. We get a very beautiful, textured, soft, painterly look to the waves and the water itself. However, I've got to say that a slow shutter is not always the best approach, particularly if you're trying to showcase the size of the waves, the power of the waves, or if you just want to create an overall more imposing type look and feel to your image. So definitely consider getting away from always using that slow shutter and speed it up a little bit. Now, how fast do you need to go? It will depend on your proximity to the waves and also your focal length. So a wider image like this, you definitely don't need to be as fast. That wider perspective means the water movement is less pronounced. So anywhere from say 200th of a second to 50 should be enough to freeze those waves. But then if you're going to go in tighter on a telephoto, like a shot like this is 800 mil. I was at 2,000th of a second. If you're going to be not that tight, but let's say maybe 200 millimeters, then you still probably want to be around 1,000th of a second. So you might need a little bit of trial and error, but that gives you a ballpark idea. Of course, there's some difficulties with using such a fast shutter speed, primarily when it comes to getting the exposure bright enough, especially if you enjoy shooting in low light like I do. So what you may have to do is lower your f-stop, so open up that aperture to help get the exposure brighter. And the problem there is that you're going to forsake your depth of field. So consider a more simplified composition. Don't get too close to any foreground matter. If you still want to, you might just have to focus stack to get everything sharp. The other thing is the ISO, you may have to boost that up a little bit as well. So just keep that in mind. So speed up the shutter, or at least try it out anyway, and get a different look and feel and texture to your water. My next tip is in regards to light and weather, and I just want to say that you don't always have to photograph a seascape in a sunrise or sunset and get those nice warm tones and colors. By nature, the ocean is a bluer tone. If it's an overcast day, you're going to have darker blues. If it's clear, obviously we'll get a brighter blue in the water. But you can photograph seascapes, particularly on those overcast days. And I find that the complementary colors in the cloud, those grays, those cool grays, work really well with coastal scenes. So consider going out on a miserable day, and the good thing is you can even do this at midday. You don't have to drag yourself out of bed early because it's all relatively the same. If it's overcast, you don't really need to be there in the evening or the morning. So just go out, and the good thing is it just gives a different feel to the scene in general. A beautiful golden and colorful sunrise or sunset, you know, yeah, it's epic, and we get this really powerful type response when we look at those images. It's more of a pleasing type feeling. But when you go out on those overcast days, particularly when there's big seas, that's where you can create those images that, you know, it's not about looking pretty, but it's about being a little bit more imposing and showcasing that rugged nature of the coast and the power of the ocean. So don't be afraid just to head out there, and you might surprise yourself. The processing will also play a big part here. So if your raw files are coming out quite grey, because it is a grey day, consider using the color grading, and I've got a video on color grading, look that up, but introduce into the mid-tones a little bit of a bluer type color palette, and you'll get a really nice harmony there with the water and your clouds as well. So consider heading out on those overcast, cloudy days for sure, and create a completely different image. Tip number 3, get rid of the wide angle and throw on a telephoto. Most of my early photography was all about putting a wide angle lens on. I used to use a tripod back then, so I'd be out there with my tripod. I'd plunk the tripod in the sand with the wide angle, and I'll just try and capture everything in front of me, especially a bit of rock in the foreground. I'd use a slow shutter and I'd just fire away, and every image started to look the same after a while. So one of my favorite ways to photograph the ocean now, particularly when there's big swell around, is to use that telephoto or even a mid-range zoom and incorporate multiple layers of detail and showcase the size and the power of those waves. So not really concerned about a foreground and getting water texture and movement in the front, but just looking out further off into the distance. Maybe it's coastal cliffs or some big sea stacks off on the horizon. Using those longer focal lengths are going to pull everything in, compress that scene, and just give you a completely different feel. And of course, if there is big waves around, this is how you do them justice, by zooming in and showcasing that size and height. And really, if you want to challenge yourself, you can even just leave the wide angle at home and force yourself just to look for compositions at those tighter focal lengths. And one thing that I'll often do is, when I get out to a specific location, you want to spend that first 10 minutes at least just looking around and enjoying the environment and seeing what speaks to you, and just start scanning along that horizon type perspective. Anything off in the distance, it's more around that 50 to 70 mil perspective. Ignore everything in front of you, because that's going to be a wide angle type focal length again. So just take that time to look out in the distance and see what speaks to you, and then from there you can get the lens on and try and bring everything closer, all those things that you're enjoying, back off in the distance. Tip number 4, incorporate the landscape into your seascape image. So what do I mean here? Well, I mean, don't always just get right down to the ocean's edge. Consider going back, get back onto the landscape a little bit, and you might be able to incorporate sand dunes with the ocean. You might be able to incorporate rainforest with the ocean, wildflowers, whatever it is. Obviously it's going to depend on your given location, but don't always just get suckered into just rushing right down to literally where the ocean is greeting the sand. Take a step back, or even as you're walking into your location, observe the surrounding area, the environment, and perhaps there's a way that you can tie the two together. Now, this does tie into our previous tip as well about using a telephoto lens. It can be very effective to get really far back and use like a mid-range, for example, let's say 70 mil. And then you're going to be able to pull in that background, but if you're really far back, then you'll still be able to get multiple layers of other details in the actual landscape environment and put that into the seascape in the background. So definitely don't always get down to the water's edge. Try and piece together that whole area, that whole coastal environment, and see what you can do. And that's something that I've really enjoyed doing recently, was looking around for plant life, wildflowers, and trying to find them in the right spot where I could still get that seascape in the background as well. Now, it's definitely a little bit easier said than done. You need a pretty good location, but you might surprise yourself at what you can find. All right, the last tip, guys, is look at the finer details. Now, just because you're going off to the beach or the coast doesn't mean that you need to capture a big epic scene. Sometimes the best images can be made at what's right in front of us, at our feet, and not including a sky or anything off in the distance, but just those finer details, typically what you'd maybe call an intimate landscape scene. There is an abundance of things that you can find around the coastline, particularly when it comes to textures and patterns in the sand or even in the water itself, particularly if you want to experiment with a little bit of ICM, intentional camera movement on the water. But then definitely scour along the coastline. Look at the rocks, the way that the water is swirling around the rocks. Maybe there's just interesting shapes and textures on the side of the cliff, wildflowers, you name it. There is so much there, so definitely keep that in mind. And the good thing about having that approach is that you could go out and create a wider image, let's call it an epic grand landscape, and then you could, once that's finished, maybe the light has done its thing, you can then start to look around and you might surprise yourself with what you find, and then you can go home with two completely different images all captured at the same time at the same place. So start to not only enjoy the grand scene, but take a look at those details. And honestly, the coast is probably one of the best places to create these intimate scenes because of the way that the water interacts with the sand and the shoreline, particularly when it comes to rocks and cliffs. There is so much there to be found. And sometimes these types of images work better when there is flat light, overcast light. So let's say you head down to the coast to do a beautiful sunrise. It doesn't quite happen for you. Don't worry, the shoot's not over. Just forget about the sky now, start to look down, and hopefully you might surprise yourself and find just a little hidden gem tucked away there waiting to be found. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you have any questions, again, leave them in the comments, or even ideas on what you want me to cover, let me know. And also please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, because I've got a lot more videos on the way. Happy photography, and I'll see you out there.